32 centuries ago, the most sophisticated world that had ever existed simply stopped existing. Not slowly, not gracefully. Within a single generation, the great palace complexes of Mycenaean Greece burned to the ground. The Hittite Empire, which had fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh, vanished so completely that later civilizations forgot it had ever existed. Ugarit, the trading capital of the Levantine coast, was reduced to ash while its final desperate letters were still hardening in the kiln. Egypt survived, barely, and never recovered. For centuries, scholars had a name for the force behind this catastrophe: the Sea Peoples. But a name is not an explanation. Where did they come from? What drove them? And what became of them after? For most of the time those questions were asked, the tools to answer them simply didn't exist. Then ancient DNA entered the picture, and what it revealed was far more human and far more extraordinary than anyone had expected. To understand what was lost, you first need to understand what existed. And what existed, by the middle of the second millennium BC, was something the world had never seen before and would not see again for centuries after its destruction. Picture a trading vessel somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean around 1300 BC. In its hold, copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from the mountains of Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic coast, ivory from Africa, pottery from Greece, grain from Egypt. A single ship carrying the material output of half the known world. We know this vessel existed because archaeologists pulled it from the seabed off the coast of southwestern Turkey in 1984. The Ulu Burun shipwreck, a 50-foot trading vessel whose cargo represented virtually every major civilization of the late Bronze Age, including evidence of a multinational crew capable of conversing across the languages of an interconnected world. That ship is not an anomaly. It is a symbol. By the 14th and 13th centuries BC, the great powers of the eastern Mediterranean had built something genuinely unprecedented: a system. Egypt in the southwest, the Hittite Empire dominating Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece to the northwest, Babylon and Assyria anchoring the east, smaller but wealthy kingdoms like Ugarit threading the connections between them. These powers traded with each other, corresponded with each other, intermarried with each other. We know this because 350 cuneiform tablets discovered at Amarna in Egypt preserve the actual diplomatic correspondence of this age. Great kings addressing each other as brothers, negotiating trade agreements, requesting shipments of gold, complaining when the shipments arrived short. The lingua franca of all this correspondence was Babylonian, not because Babylon dominated the others, but because a common diplomatic language had evolved naturally out of centuries of contact. That detail alone tells you something important about how integrated this world had become. What held it together militarily was the chariot. Fast, expensive, devastatingly effective on flat terrain, the chariot was the tank of the Bronze Age. It was also the perfect weapon for a wealthy, centralized state. You needed skilled craftsmen to build them, trained horses to pull them, professional warriors to operate them, and a surplus economy to pay for all of it. The chariot didn't just win battles, it encoded power into a technology that only states could afford, which meant the system it protected was also the system it depended upon. And that system had a vulnerability built into its very sophistication. The tin required to produce the bronze that equipped those chariot armies came almost entirely from Afghanistan, traveling thousands of kilometers along overland routes before reaching the smiths of Greece, Egypt, and Hatti. Copper came primarily from Cyprus. Grain moved from Egypt northward. Luxury goods, diplomatic gifts, raw materials, finished weapons, all of it flowing continuously along routes that required stability at every node to function. Remove one node and the flow slowed. Remove several simultaneously and the whole architecture of exchange began to buckle. By the late 13th century BC, the reports filtering in from across the system were troubling. Famine was racking the Hittite highlands year after year. In Greece, the great palace complexes were beginning to invest in wall extensions and additional fortifications, the archaeological signature of people who have started to feel genuinely afraid. Letters from the king of Ugarit carry a new and unmistakable urgency. The ships of the enemy, he writes, have been seen. Nobody who read those letters could have understood what was coming. The most stable and prosperous world that had ever existed was standing at the edge of something it had no framework to anticipate. Within a generation, almost all of it would be gone. Then one day, around 1177 BCE, black sails appeared off the Egyptian coast. A fleet of sleek war vessels moving into the mouth of the Nile, oar-powered and fast, carrying warriors whose appearance struck the Egyptians as genuinely foreign. Some wore feathered headdresses, others wore horned helmets. Their armor was a mixture of heavy plate and light leather, their weaponry built around long slashing swords and javelins, rather than the bows and spears that had defined Bronze Age warfare for centuries. They were not a uniformed army representing a single state. They were something harder to categorize. A confederation. A coalition of peoples moving together with a shared purpose, even if their origins were scattered across half the Mediterranean world. Pharaoh Ramesses III met them on the Nile, and according to Ramesses III, he won. This is where the historian's instinct for skepticism becomes essential. Pharaohs never lost. The monumental inscriptions carved into the walls of Medinet Habu, Ramesses' vast mortuary complex at Thebes, describe a total and glorious Egyptian victory in the language that Egyptian royal propaganda had been using for 1,000 years. The enemy is crushed, the pharaoh is triumphant, the gods are satisfied. What makes the Medinet Habu account unusual is not its triumphalism, but the scale of the threat it felt compelled to describe. According to the inscription, no land had been able to stand before these invaders. They had already torn through Hadi, through Carchemish, through Arzawa, through Al-Ashia, a trail of destruction matching the archaeological record of collapsed civilizations across the entire eastern Mediterranean, ending at Egypt's door. A pharaoh who was genuinely winning didn't need to explain quite so carefully how dangerous the enemy had been. The named groups carved into those reliefs have occupied scholars ever since. The Pelaset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, 5 peoples named in the 1177 BCE account, part of a larger roster of 9 or 10 groups that appear across Egyptian sources spanning several decades. Because this was not a single event. That detail is critical and consistently underappreciated. The attack on Ramesses III was the second major invasion attempt on Egypt within 30 years. Around 1207 BCE, his father Meremptah had already turned back a combined force of Libyans and Sea Peoples, including the Shurdan, the Shekelesh, and the Luka, on the western approaches to the delta. The Sea Peoples were not a sudden eruption from nowhere. They were a pressure that had been building for decades, appearing in Egyptian records as pirates, as mercenaries, as raiders, and finally as something that looked uncomfortably like a migration in force. The reliefs at Medinet Habu preserve one detail that carries particular weight. Alongside the warships and the fighting men, the images show ox carts loaded with women, children, and possessions. These were not purely raiding parties looking for plunder and a fast withdrawal. At least some of these people were moving, bringing everything they owned, looking for somewhere to land permanently. What the Egyptian sources cannot tell us is the view from the other direction. They are, unavoidably, Egyptian, triumphalist, propagandistic, and written entirely by the civilization these peoples were attempting to enter or destroy. The Sea Peoples themselves left no written records, no inscriptions of their own, no account of what drove them or what they believed they were doing. Everything we know about them, for most of history, has been filtered through the perspective of the one major power that successfully resisted them, a power that, despite its claimed victory on the Nile, would spend the following centuries slowly declining into irrelevance. Egypt survived the Sea Peoples. It just didn't survive what came after. The debate about who the Sea Peoples actually were is almost as old as the modern study of ancient history itself. When the French Egyptologist Emmanuel de Rouget first used the phrase peoples of the sea in 1855 to describe the nations depicted at Medinet Habu, he was naming a problem as much as solving one. His successor Gaston Maspero popularized the term and attached it to the migration theories fashionable in the 19th century, connecting the sea peoples to the movements of early European peoples in ways that reflected the intellectual preoccupations of his own era more than the evidence of the ancient one. The framework stuck even as the interpretations shifted. For the better part of 2 centuries, scholars have been circling the same fundamental difficulty: 9 or 10 named groups, wildly different appearances in the Egyptian reliefs, no written records from the sea peoples themselves, and an almost complete absence of the kind of biological evidence that could settle the question of origins with any real precision. What scholarship was left with for most of that time was pottery and helmet shapes, and pottery and helmet shapes can only take you so far. The Shurden are perhaps the most visually striking of the named groups, depicted with distinctive horned helmets and round shields, and long associated with Sardinia. The connection has genuine archaeological weight behind it. The Nuragic culture of Bronze Age Sardinia produced bronze figurines bearing a remarkable resemblance to the warriors carved at Medinet Habu. The island was rich in copper and lead, positioned at the center of the Mediterranean with trade links extending east and west, and its material culture shows signs of significant militarization precisely in the centuries leading up to the collapse. Shurden warriors appear in Egyptian records long before 1177 BC, fighting as mercenaries at Kadesh, serving as Ramesses II's personal bodyguard, and launching an unsuccessful raid on the Nile early in his reign. A relationship with Egypt spanning more than 3 centuries, oscillating between service and hostility in a way that feels less like foreign invasion and more like a recurring feature of the Bronze Age world. The Peliset present the strongest overall case for a definitive identification. The argument that they became the Philistines of the Old Testament, settling the southern Levantine coast in the years immediately following the collapse, is supported by archaeology at the 5 cities of the Philistine Pentapolis. Distinctive pottery styles, changed food practices, new architectural traditions, and a material culture with clear Aegean connections all point toward an incoming population rather than a simple continuity with what came before. The Luca are more straightforwardly placed. We know almost certainly where Luca was. It is Lycia, in the far southwest of modern Turkey, a region with a long and well-documented history of maritime raiding that predates the collapse by centuries. Luca ships appear in the Amarna letters in Hittite records, in the desperate final correspondence of Ugarit. These were not newcomers to the business of seaborne violence. The Aquesh are more contentious and more tantalizing. The name's similarity to the Achaeans of Homer, the Greeks of the Iliad, has been noted for generations. Mycenaean warriors are depicted in Egyptian art long before the collapse, serving as mercenaries in foreign armies, familiar figures in the Bronze Age world's military labor market. Whether the Aquesh represent displaced Mycenaeans, opportunistic raiders from the Aegean, or something more complicated remains genuinely unresolved. That unresolved quality runs through all of it. Without biological evidence, every identification was ultimately a plausible argument. Compelling in places, frustratingly circumstantial everywhere else. The DNA was going to change that. But before it did, the more urgent question needed answering first. Not who the sea peoples were, but what had pushed an entire world to the breaking point that produced them. Here is where the simple story breaks down entirely. For a long time, the instinct was to treat the sea peoples as the explanation for the Bronze Age collapse. A force arrives, civilizations fall, causation established. It is a clean narrative, and it is almost certainly wrong, or at least dramatically incomplete. The more carefully archaeologists and scientists have examined the evidence, the more apparent it has become that the collapse was not a single blow delivered by a single agent. It was a cascade, a system failure of compounding crises arriving faster than any one of them could be addressed individually. Start with the climate. In recent decades, paleoclimatology has added something to the collapse debate that no amount of pottery analysis ever could. Pollen samples extracted from lake beds across the eastern Mediterranean tell a consistent story. Beginning around 1200 BC, the region experienced a prolonged and severe drought. Rainfall dropped significantly across large areas. In many places where crops had sustained dense populations for centuries, the ground was becoming desert. For highland kingdoms like Hatti, already difficult to feed in good years, already dependent on grain shipments from Egypt that had to travel enormous distances to arrive, the consequences of sustained crop failure were not economic inconvenience. They were existential. Then there are the earthquakes. Seismological analysis of the 12th century BC Eastern Mediterranean reveals a remarkable clustering of major seismic events across Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant. Destruction layers at multiple sites match not just the timeline of the collapse, but the specific signature of earthquake damage rather than deliberate burning. Notably, Egypt sits outside the seismic zone that absorbed these shocks, which may go some way toward explaining why Egypt alone, among the great Bronze Age powers, managed to survive, weakened but intact, while everything around it fell. The tin supply deserves its own moment. Bronze Age military power was literally made of bronze, and bronze required tin, and tin came almost entirely from Afghanistan. When the overland routes that carried it westward were disrupted, the consequences rippled outward through every army, every palace economy, every system of political control that depended on bronze to function. Iron existed as an alternative, but smelting it required temperatures significantly higher than bronze, making it technically demanding and initially rare. The shift toward iron that followed the collapse was not a choice. It was an adaptation to scarcity, and iron, once mastered, proved to be the great leveler. It could be found almost everywhere, which meant that the technological monopoly that had kept palace economies powerful was gone. The internal dimension of the collapse is perhaps the most unsettling piece of the puzzle. At several sites, the destruction pattern is specific. The palace structures burned. The surrounding settlements did not. That is not the signature of an outside invader sweeping through indiscriminately. That is the signature of people who knew exactly what they wanted to destroy. Populations who had supported palace economies through generations of taxation and conscription, now watching those economies fail to protect them from famine and earthquake and raids, may have made their own conclusions about where the problem originated. What all of this produces is a picture in which the Sea Peoples were as much symptom as cause. People already displaced by drought, or freed from collapsed palace authority, or drawn into a power vacuum created by the simultaneous failure of every major stabilizing force in the region. Wolves, certainly. But wolves circling a wounded animal, not a healthy one. The world that the Sea Peoples attacked was already destroying itself. They arrived at the moment of maximum vulnerability, and in some cases they may have been running from the same disaster they appeared to be causing. For most of human history, the dead kept their origins secret. Whatever journeys they had made, whatever distances their ancestors had crossed, whatever populations they descended from, all of it disappeared with them into the ground. Then ancient DNA changed that. Scientists learned to extract and sequence genetic material from bones thousands of years old, from teeth and inner ear structures where biological information survives longest. And suddenly the past began speaking in an entirely new language. Not the language of objects and destruction layers and helmet shapes, but the language of biology itself. When that language was finally applied to the question of the Sea Peoples, it did not produce a single clean answer. What it produced was something considerably more interesting. The most significant genetic study to directly address the Sea Peoples question focused on the Philistines, the group with the strongest archaeological case for a Sea Peoples origin. Researchers extracted ancient DNA from individuals buried in the earliest layers of Ashkelon, one of the 5 cities of the Philistine Pentapolis, covering the period from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age. What they found was a clear and unambiguous signal of European ancestry in the earliest Philistine burials, ancestry that was simply absent in the Canaanite population that had occupied the same region in the preceding centuries. This was not a marginal statistical trace. It was a genuine discontinuity marking the arrival of a population from somewhere else. The European ancestry component pointed specifically towards southern Europe and the Aegean, not a single precise origin point, but a direction. Consistent with the long-argued connection between the Palisade and the Mycenaean world, now carrying biological weight behind it rather than resting purely on pottery analysis and artistic comparison. The archaeological argument and the genetic argument were for the first time pointing the same way simultaneously. Then came the detail that speaks most directly to what actually happened to these people. Within 2 or 3 generations, the distinct European genetic signal present in the earliest Philistine burials begins to fade. By the later Iron Age layers at Ashkelon, it has blended substantially into the surrounding Levantine population. The Sea Peoples did not remain a separate biological community sealed off from the world around them. They arrived, they settled, they integrated, and within a few generations their descendants were genetically indistinguishable from the broader regional population. The boundary dissolved. The identity persisted in culture and in memory long after it had ceased to exist in biology. The genetic work on ancient Sardinians adds a further dimension. Studies of Nuragic period remains confirmed that the Bronze Age Sardinian population was genuinely distinct, carrying its own specific ancestral signature that set it apart from contemporary mainland Italian populations and showed connections reaching across the Mediterranean. The biological individuality of the Nuragic culture, long argued on archaeological grounds, has genetic reality behind it. What the DNA does not show is equally important. There is no single unified genetic identity running across all the named Sea Peoples groups. No shared biological signature tying the Sheridan to the Peliset, to the Luca, to the Ekwesh in a way that would suggest a common homeland or a single originating population. They were genuinely multiple peoples. The Egyptian sources, for once, were accurate in depicting them as a coalition of distinct groups rather than a single nation. And there is no ghost population, no inexplicable outside ancestry arriving from nowhere without archaeological explanation. The Sea Peoples were not a mystery civilization seeded from beyond the known world. They were products of the Bronze Age Mediterranean itself, its trade networks, its mercenary traditions, its centuries of maritime connection between East and West. The genetics confirm what the most careful archaeology had already implied. These people came from within the system. They were the system, coming apart at the seams. The Sea Peoples did not disappear after Egypt. That is the part of the story that tends to get lost in the drama of the collapse itself. Ramesses III's own inscriptions record something that his triumphalist framing cannot quite conceal. He settled defeated Sea Peoples groups in Canaan as Egyptian vassals. The Peliset, in particular, were planted along the southern Levantine coast, technically under Egyptian authority, functioning in practice as a buffer population guarding the imperial frontier against further instability from the north and east. It was a pragmatic solution to a problem that military victory alone had not resolved. You could turn back a fleet on the Nile. You could not turn back the displacement of entire populations with nowhere else to go. The Philistine pentapolis that grew from this settlement became one of the most archaeologically visible cultures of the early Iron Age. At Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza, the material fingerprint of an incoming population is unmistakable. Aegean-style pottery appears in the earliest occupation layers, distinct from anything produced in Canaan before the collapse. Food practices changed. Pork and beef, not typically associated with the region, but strongly associated with the Aegean world, appear in the faunal record. Architecture shifted. A culture was establishing itself, drawing on origins it carried across the Mediterranean while absorbing the landscape it had landed in. That culture became famous, or rather infamous, in a way its founders could not have anticipated. The Philistines of the Old Testament, the great antagonists of early Israelite history, the people of Goliath, preserved the memory of the Sea Peoples in one of the most widely read texts in human history. Whatever their origins in the chaos of the late Bronze Age, they achieved a kind of immortality in narrative that most civilizations of the collapse did not. Their name has outlasted their cities, their language, their biology, and very nearly their archaeology. The Sherdeen followed a different trajectory. Evidence of Sherdeen mercenaries serving in Egyptian armies extends more than 3 centuries beyond the collapse, appearing in administrative documents through the 20th dynasty. Some were settled in Egypt with land grants and elite status, their relationship with the pharaonic state evolving from recurring threat to integrated military community in a pattern that feels strikingly familiar. It is not so different from the Germanic soldiers who served in the late Roman army, achieving positions of influence within the very system their ancestors had raided. The parallel is uncomfortable but instructive. Cyprus emerges from the genetic and archaeological evidence as a critical node in the whole story. The refortification boom on the island around 1200 BC, the presence of Aegean-style material culture at sites like Nkomi, the bronze figurines with horned helmets that echo both Sardinian and Egyptian sources, all point to an island functioning simultaneously as refuge, staging post, and melting pot for displaced populations from across the collapsing system. People who had lost their palaces, their kingdoms, their trade networks converged on the island at the intersection of everything, forging new identities out of the wreckage of old ones. The genetic legacy of all this movement persists. The European ancestry component introduced into the Levantine population by the earliest Philistine settlers did not vanish entirely. Diluted across generations of integration, it remains detectable in the regional gene pool. The people of Gaza today carry, among the complex layers of their ancestry, a biological thread reaching back across the Mediterranean to the Bronze Age world, whose collapse deposited their ancestors on that particular shore. The Sea Peoples set out to find a world to enter. They found one, became part of it, and in doing so, quietly became us. Those carved reliefs at Medinet Habu are still there. Warriors in feathered headdresses and horned helmets, frozen in limestone, locked in combat on the Nile, presiding over a victory that couldn't stop the slow collapse of everything behind it. For 3,000 years, they stood without names, without origins, without biology. The DNA didn't solve everything. The Sea Peoples remained plural, elusive, resistant to a single clean explanation. But what the genetics accomplished was something more important than solving the mystery. It humanized it. These were traceable people, carrying European ancestry into the Levant, whose descendants are alive today across the region. The Bronze Age collapse was not visited upon the ancient world by an alien force arriving from nowhere. It was generated from within, by the same interconnected, ambitious, desperate humanity that had built that world in the first place. They destroyed it, they survived it, and in the most literal biological sense, they became us.